Every intelligent species in the galaxy follows the same rule, Lyra Veth said with calm academic confidence, her pale blue hands resting beside a glowing hollow display in the center of the Orion Exchange Institute lecture hall. Reproduction occurs only during a limited biological season. The room was filled with students from a dozen star systems, scales shimmering under soft white lights, antennae tilting in attention, eyes of every color focused on the rotating genetic diagrams floating above the podium. Outside the transparent dome of the station, a slow river of stars drifted past the orbiting campus, silent and ancient. Lyra adjusted the projection and continued, her voice steady, practiced after weeks of preparation. This cycle prevents instability in advanced civilizations. It ensures population balance, social order, and predictable biological rhythms. Several alien students nodded while recording the lecture. One species tapped data into wrist pads. Another quietly pulsed colors across its skin in agreement. For thousands of years, this principle had been accepted across the galactic academic network. Biology shaped civilization. Instinct defined limits. Lyra turned to the next slide where a long list of known species appeared in neat rows of data. Each one showed the same pattern. Restricted reproductive window, carefully evolved control through seasonal cycles. The evidence was overwhelming. Proven. Reliable. She allowed herself a small breath of satisfaction. Her thesis presentation was going perfectly. Without these cycles, Lyra continued, a society would likely collapse under constant biological pressure. Evolution simply would not allow such instability to persist. A quiet murmur moved through the hall as the logic settled comfortably across the room. Then a human raised his hand. Daniel Carter sat halfway up the curved rows of seats, leaning back casually in his chair, a half-finished notebook balanced on his knee. His brown hair looked slightly unorganized, like he had run his hand through it one too many times while thinking. Humans were still relatively new to the Institute exchange program, and many alien students studied them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Lyra paused and acknowledged him politely. Yes, human student. Daniel shrugged slightly, as if he were asking about homework rather than challenging a galactic biological principle. Humans don't have a mating season. For 2 full seconds, nothing moved in the lecture hall. Then several students turned their heads slowly toward him. A few data pads stopped recording mid-sentence. Lyra blinked once, certain she had misunderstood the translation software. I'm sorry, she said carefully. Your species must have a reproductive cycle that occurs annually or biannually. Daniel shook his head. Nope. The projector hummed quietly behind her. Lyra felt a strange cold ripple move down her spine. Then you mean your cycle is triggered by environmental conditions? Temperature perhaps? Planetary orbit? Daniel scratched the back of his neck. No, it's just always possible. This time the silence lasted longer. Somewhere in the room a chair shifted slightly. A student from a crystalline species made a soft cracking sound of confusion. Lyra stared at Daniel Carter as if he had just told her gravity worked only on weekends. Her mind began racing through every rule she knew about evolutionary stability. Every known civilization depended on predictable biology. Remove the cycle and chaos would follow. Population spikes. Social collapse. Endless biological pressure. And yet humanity clearly existed. Thriving. Expanding. Sitting casually in the middle of her classroom, wearing sneakers, and looking mildly concerned that he might have interrupted her presentation. Lyra slowly turned toward the hollow screen and erased the line that read reproductive season, universal law. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, carried a quiet disbelief. Human Daniel Carter, she said, I believe we need to verify something immediately. Daniel looked around at the suddenly tense classroom and gave a small, uncertain smile. Yeah, he said, that's usually how this conversation goes. The walk from the lecture hall to the biology laboratory was only 300 feet, but the silence between Lyra Veth and Daniel Carter felt much longer than that. Students stepped aside as they passed through the curved corridor of the Orion Exchange Institute, whispering quietly in half a dozen languages. Word traveled fast on a station filled with scientists. The rumor had already begun spreading through the academic network. A human had just challenged one of the most stable biological assumptions in the galaxy. Lyra moved quickly, her pale blue fingers hovering over a portable data pad, while she pulled up comparative anatomy files. Her mind worked with disciplined speed, searching for a logical explanation that would restore order to the theory she had just defended in front of a full lecture hall. Perhaps the translation system had misunderstood Daniel's statement. Perhaps human biology had an obscure trigger that simply had not been documented yet. Evolution always followed rules. It had to. When they reached the laboratory door, Lyra placed her hand on the scanner, and the panel slid open with a soft mechanical sigh. Inside, rows of diagnostic equipment glowed under bright white lights. Transparent cylinders held atmospheric samples from distant planets, and a large medical scanner stood in the center of the room like a silent machine waiting for instructions. Daniel stepped inside and looked around with casual curiosity. "Nice lab," he said, glancing at the polished metal floor and the quiet hum of instruments drawing power from the station grid. "Your equipment is about 20 years ahead of Earth technology." Lyra did not answer immediately. She was already activating the biological scanner. A ring of soft blue light spread across the surface of the machine as internal systems woke up and began their diagnostic cycle. "Please stand here," she said, gesturing to the center platform. Daniel stepped into position and folded his arms loosely while the machine began its work. Thin beams of light moved across his body, measuring cellular activity, hormone levels, and genetic stability. Lyra watched the display carefully as streams of information appeared across the floating screen. At first everything looked normal. Oxygen saturation within healthy range. Cellular repair functioning correctly. Hormone levels consistent with a stable adult male of the species Homo sapiens. Then the reproductive panel activated. Lyra leaned closer to the screen. The data refreshed again. And again, the result did not change. Active fertility status, continuous. Lyra felt the small muscles in her shoulders tighten. She recalibrated the scanner and repeated the analysis. The machine hummed softly while it confirmed the measurement with a deeper biological scan. Daniel waited patiently while leaning slightly against the side rail of the platform. After another 10 seconds, the result appeared again. Active fertility status, continuous. Lyra slowly turned her head toward him. "Human Daniel Carter," she said carefully. "According to this medical scanner, your reproductive system does not enter a dormant phase at any point during the year." Daniel nodded. "That sounds right." Lyra looked back at the screen. There is no biological pause. No seasonal trigger. No planetary alignment requirement. Daniel gave a small shrug. "Nope." The laboratory suddenly felt very quiet. Lyra stared at the glowing line of data that refused to change. Across the galaxy, thousands of intelligent species required strict biological timing in order to prevent chaos. Entire civilizations had evolved around those limits. But the humans standing calmly in front of her appeared to live without any of them. Lyra folded her arms slowly while processing the implications. "If your biology truly operates this way," she said quietly, "then something else must be controlling your species." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Yeah," he replied with a faint smile. "That is the interesting part." Lyra Veth remained standing beside the medical scanner long after the final line of data stopped updating. The glowing screen in front of her displayed the same result over and over again, as if the machine itself refused to believe what it had discovered. Continuous fertility. No cycle. No biological restriction. No evolutionary pause. Across thousands of documented species, reproduction was carefully limited by nature itself. Entire civilizations depended on that rhythm. Populations rose and stabilized according to seasons written deep inside genetic code. It was the most reliable biological safety system the galaxy had ever known. Yet the human leaning casually against the scanning rail appeared to exist completely outside of it. Daniel Carter looked more curious than concerned. He watched Lyra studying the screen with the quiet patience of someone who had seen this reaction before. The soft lights of the laboratory reflected across the polished metal floor, while the station's distant engines hummed somewhere far beneath the research wing. After a long moment, Lyra finally spoke again, her voice slower now, more careful than it had been during the lecture. "If your species does not rely on reproductive cycles, then population stability should be mathematically impossible." She turned slightly toward Daniel while still holding the data pad in her hand. "Every known civilization requires biological limitation to maintain social order. Daniel thought about that for a second and then nodded slowly. Well, he said, Earth has had a few moments where population growth got a little out of control. Lyra looked back at the screen. A little. Daniel lifted one hand in a mild gesture. A few billion people over a couple of centuries tends to get attention. Lyra blinked again. Even the translation system hesitated before confirming the number. Billions. The word echoed quietly in her mind while she imagined the scale of such a population. Entire planetary ecosystems would have to adapt just to support it. Yet humanity had not collapsed. Their civilization had spread across multiple star systems. Their technology had advanced rapidly enough to earn a place in the Orion Exchange Institute among older species that had evolved over tens of thousands of years. None of it made sense if their biology operated without limits. Lyra slowly lowered the datapad. Then what prevents constant reproduction? She asked. If the biological capacity is always present, what mechanism stops it? Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the rail of the scanner platform. He seemed to search for the right way to explain something that humans rarely thought about as unusual. A lot of things, he said calmly. Culture, responsibility, laws, personal decisions, relationships, timing, life plans. Lyra listened carefully to each word. None of them were biological terms. None of them appeared in evolutionary models. You are describing social choices, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Exactly. The laboratory lights hummed softly above them while Lyra stared at the data screen one more time. Her entire academic training had taught her that biology controlled behavior. Instinct set the boundaries of civilization. But the humans standing a few feet away seemed to represent the opposite idea. His species carried constant biological capability, and yet their society survived through something far less predictable. Choice. Lyra folded her arms slowly while a new thought began forming in the back of her mind. Human Daniel Carter, she said carefully. In most species, instinct protects civilization from chaos. Daniel gave a small smile. Yeah, he replied. Humans just had to figure out another way. Lyra looked back at the glowing screen one last time, and for the first time since the scan had finished, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her thoughts. It was not confusion anymore. It was curiosity about a possibility that biology alone had never explained. The laboratory lights dimmed slightly as the station shifted into its evening energy cycle, casting a softer glow across the polished instruments and glass panels that lined the walls. Lyra Veth stood quietly beside the scanner platform, reviewing the same biological report for the fourth time. The numbers refused to change. Continuous reproductive capability. No seasonal suppression. No hormonal shutdown period. No evolutionary safeguard. Her training insisted that such a system should destabilize any intelligent civilization within a few generations. Yet humanity had survived for tens of thousands of years. More than survived. They had built cities, governments, cultures, and now interstellar travel. Daniel. Carter stepped down from the scanner platform and stretched slightly, rolling his shoulders after standing still for several minutes. So, he said casually, glancing at the glowing screen behind her. Does that answer your question? Lyra did not respond immediately. Her eyes moved slowly across the biological chart, analyzing hormone levels, reproductive viability indicators, and neurological stability markers. Every measurement suggested the same conclusion. Human biology allowed the possibility of reproduction at nearly any point during adult life. The machine had verified it 3 times. She finally looked up at him. Your species carries constant biological potential, she said carefully. In most civilizations that would create continuous behavioral pressure. Daniel leaned against a nearby console and folded his arms. You mean instinct pushing people all the time? Lyra nodded slowly. Yes. In most species, such pressure would overwhelm social structures. Evolution normally solves that problem by limiting fertility windows. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod. Earth biology did not do that. Lyra studied his expression. There was no embarrassment, no sense of alarm, only quiet acceptance. It was as if he were discussing the weather rather than a biological anomaly that challenged centuries of galactic science. Then human society must rely heavily on artificial regulation, she continued. Legal systems, cultural expectations, education. Daniel smiled slightly. All of those, yeah. Lyra began walking slowly around the laboratory while considering the implications. The room hummed with the quiet rhythm of scientific equipment running constant background diagnostics. Through a large observation window, she could see the curve of the station ring and the distant stars beyond it. Somewhere inside those lights were dozens of civilizations built around biological cycles that nature had carefully designed. Humanity seemed to be the exception. She stopped beside a workstation and pulled up historical population data from Earth. The graph rose sharply across the centuries, climbing from millions to billions within a relatively short evolutionary span. Yet the curve eventually stabilized. Governments formed. Laws were written. Cultural traditions evolved around partnership, family structure, and long-term responsibility. Lyra leaned closer to the screen. None of those stabilizing forces came from biology. They came from decisions. She turned back, toward Daniel slowly. Your species replaced instinct with structure, she said quietly. Daniel shrugged again in that relaxed human way that seemed almost disarming. More like we learned the hard way, he replied. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Meaning? Daniel gestured toward the population graph floating in the air beside her. Humans had to figure out that biology gives us possibilities, but society decides what we do with them. Lyra stared at the rising curve of human history for another long moment. Across the galaxy, evolution had solved the same problem by limiting the body. Humanity appeared to have solved it by teaching the mind. And that idea felt far more unusual than any biological mutation she had ever studied. Lyra Veth remained near the workstation while the human population graph hovered in the air like a quiet challenge to everything she had studied. The curve rose across centuries of Earth history, climbing steadily until it reached billions of individuals living on a single planet barely 8,000 miles across. By every model used in galactic evolutionary science, that kind of biological pressure should have pushed civilization toward collapse long before humanity ever reached spaceflight. Yet the opposite had happened. Human society had become more organized, more structured, and more technologically advanced as their numbers increased. Lyra slowly lowered the display brightness and turned to face Daniel Carter again. He had moved to the observation window and was looking out at the long arc of the station ring where transport lights glided silently along the outer corridor. Beyond that transparent wall, stars stretched across the darkness like distant lanterns. Daniel noticed her watching him and gave a small curious smile. You were still thinking about it, right? He asked. Lyra nodded once. Your biology provides constant reproductive capability, she said carefully. Yet your civilization remains stable. That contradicts several thousand years of evolutionary theory. Daniel leaned lightly against the window frame. It sounds strange when you say it that way, he admitted. Lyra stepped closer to the projection again and reopened the medical scan results. The machine confirmed the same information with quiet certainty. Continuous fertility. Stable neurological patterns. Balanced hormone regulation. She folded her arms slowly. For most species, she said, instinct is the primary control mechanism. Biology determines when reproduction can occur, and society simply adapts to that limitation. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Humans never had that kind of schedule. Lyra looked up. Then how does an individual human decide when to reproduce? She asked. Daniel considered the question for a moment. Usually it is a combination of things, he explained. People think about their career, their financial situation, their relationship stability, and whether they are ready to raise a family. Sometimes religion or cultural traditions influence the decision too. In the United States where I grew up, people talk about planning for the future before starting a family. Lyra listened closely. Every factor he described belonged to psychology or social organization rather than biology. So the decision happens in the mind rather than in the body, she said slowly. Daniel nodded again. Exactly. Lyra walked toward the observation window beside him and looked out at the quiet movement of ships docking along the station ring. Several different species moved along the corridor outside, each one shaped by evolutionary rules that controlled their instincts through biological timing. Humanity appeared to operate under a completely different principle. Your species possesses a biological capability that could easily destabilize society, she said quietly. Daniel glanced toward her. But it does not, he replied. Lyra watched the distant stars for a moment before answering. No, she said thoughtfully. Because your civilization depends on something far less predictable than instinct. Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly. Which is? Lyra finally looked back at him with calm scientific curiosity. Self-control, she said. The human student gave a soft laugh and nodded toward the silent medical scanner behind them. Yeah, he said. Turns out evolution forgot to install a biological limit. So humans had to invent one ourselves. Lyra Veth remained beside the wide observation window while the distant lights of docking transports moved slowly across the outer ring of the Orion Exchange Institute. The station rotated gently around the nearby blue star, and every few seconds the sunlight shifted across the glass floor in long, quiet bands. She had studied dozens of species during her academic training, each one shaped by evolutionary systems designed to keep biological instinct within strict limits. Nature created cycles, pauses, and hormonal signals that prevented instability. It was elegant, predictable, safe. Yet the human standing beside her represented a completely different solution. Daniel Carter rested his hands in the pockets of his jacket while looking out at the ships arriving from distant colonies. Cargo carriers, research vessels, diplomatic transports. Many of them carried passengers from species that had spent thousands of years refining the balance between instinct and civilization. Daniel noticed Lyra studying the traffic patterns and spoke quietly. You are still running the numbers in your head, right? Lyra gave a small nod. Yes, she admitted. I am attempting to understand how a species with constant reproductive capability avoids continuous biological pressure. Daniel turned slightly toward her. Humans definitely feel pressure sometimes, he said. We are still biological organisms. Lyra looked at him with focused curiosity. Then the control mechanism must exist somewhere else in your neural development. Daniel smiled faintly. It does, he replied. It just does not come from instinct alone. Lyra activated another small projection on the laboratory wall. This one showed neurological mapping from the earlier medical scan. Human brain regions responsible for long-term planning glowed softly on the display. Decision-making networks, social reasoning pathways, behavioral inhibition centers. She studied the pattern carefully. Your species appears to rely heavily on cognitive restraint, she said. Daniel nodded. People learn from family, culture, education, and personal experience. Humans grow up being taught responsibility. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Responsibility, she repeated. The word carried more weight than any hormone chart. Daniel continued explaining while the station lights reflected faintly across the polished lab instruments. Parents teach their kids about relationships. Schools teach health education. Governments create laws about age, family rights, and consent. Communities have traditions about partnership and commitment. Lyra watched the neural projection slowly rotating above the workstation. None of those stabilizing systems were encoded directly into DNA. They were built gradually through learning and shared understanding. So your species constructed an external structure to guide behavior, she said thoughtfully. Daniel nodded again. Exactly. Humans know that biology gives us the ability, but society teaches us when it is the right time. Lyra walked slowly across the room while considering the idea from every scientific angle. In most civilizations, instinct set the boundary and society filled the space inside it. Humanity seemed to reverse the order. Their biology allowed wide freedom, and their culture built the boundaries afterward. She finally stopped beside the quiet medical scanner that had revealed the original anomaly. The screen still displayed the same line of text that had disrupted her lecture only an hour earlier. Continuous fertility. Lyra placed one hand lightly against the console while looking at the reflection of the stars in the glass surface. Human Daniel Carter, she said calmly. Your species may represent a unique evolutionary path. Daniel looked up from the observation window. How so? Lyra turned toward him with thoughtful seriousness. Most intelligent life forms are controlled by instinct, she explained. But humans appear to be guided primarily by something else. Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly. And what would that be? Lyra allowed a small pause while the laboratory lights hummed quietly around them. Choice, she said. Lyra Veth stood quietly beside the laboratory console, while the words she had just spoken seemed to settle across the room like a new law of physics. Choice. It was a concept that existed in every intelligent species, yet rarely as the primary force controlling biological behavior. The medical scanner hummed softly behind her, its display still glowing with the same unwavering data. Continuous fertility. Daniel Carter leaned against the observation window again, watching the slow movement of docking vessels outside the station. A cargo transport nearly 400 feet long drifted toward a docking port with careful precision while navigation lights blinked steadily along its hull. Daniel glanced back at Lyra and gave a small, thoughtful smile. "You are not wrong," he said. "Humans talk about choice all the time." Lyra studied him with quiet scientific interest. "But your species is still influenced by instinct," she said. "Every biological system produces impulses." Daniel nodded. "Of course. Hunger, fear, attraction, curiosity. Humans feel all of that." He paused for a moment and tapped the glass window lightly with one finger while thinking. "The difference is that humans spend their whole lives learning when to follow those impulses and when to ignore them." Lyra walked slowly back toward the workstation and reopened the neurological projection from the earlier scan. The rotating image of Daniel's brain appeared again above the console, glowing with soft blue light that traced the pathways of higher reasoning and behavioral restraint. She pointed toward a cluster of neural activity located near the front of the model. "Your species appears to have a highly developed decision-making center," she observed. Daniel stepped closer and looked at the projection with mild curiosity. "That part helps people think about long-term consequences," he explained. "Humans are pretty good at imagining the future." Lyra nodded slowly. "So your civilization depends on anticipation rather than biological timing." Daniel smiled slightly. "Yeah. People think about what kind of life they want before making certain choices." The laboratory fell quiet again while the station rotated gently outside the window. A long band of sunlight moved across the floor and climbed slowly up the side of the scanner console. Lyra watched the neurological model for several seconds while comparing it to the evolutionary data stored in her academic files. Most intelligent species developed instinct first and culture second. Humanity seemed to have amplified something different. Their biology allowed freedom, but their minds created boundaries through reflection, planning, and shared understanding. She turned back toward Daniel with growing fascination. "If your species truly operates this way," she said carefully, "then the stability of your civilization is not protected by biology at all." Daniel gave a relaxed shrug. "Not really." Lyra folded her arms while considering the implication. Across the galaxy, evolution solved problems by adjusting bodies. But humanity had solved one of the most powerful biological pressures by strengthening the mind. She looked once more at the scanner display and then back at the human student who had casually overturned an entire lecture hall's worth of accepted science. "Your species," she said slowly, "may be the first civilization where instinct is not the final authority." Daniel chuckled softly and glanced toward the busy corridor outside the laboratory where students from a dozen worlds continued their daily routines without realizing the discussion happening inside this room. "Well," he said calmly, "humans figured out something a long time ago." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "What is that?" Daniel looked back at her with an easy expression. "Just because you can do something," he said, "does not mean you should." The laboratory had grown quieter as the station entered its late orbital cycle, and the steady glow of distant stars reflected across the wide observation window like a silent audience watching the conversation unfold. Lyra Veth stood beside the projection console while Daniel Carter's words lingered in her thoughts with unexpected weight. Just because you can do something does not mean you should. For many species across the galaxy, such a statement would not even exist as a cultural idea. Biology dictated behavior with precise efficiency. Instinct created boundaries. Evolution enforced limits. Choice rarely needed to intervene because the body already decided. Yet the human standing in front of her came from a civilization where the body allowed nearly anything and the mind had to decide what was right. Lyra slowly deactivated the neurological projection and the glowing model of Daniel's brain faded into the console surface. The laboratory lighting dimmed slightly as the station rotated away from the star outside, leaving only the cool interior illumination and the quiet hum of equipment maintaining the research systems. Daniel moved away from the observation window and glanced at the medical scanner that had started this entire discussion. "So," he said gently, Did your theory survive the test? Lyra considered the question carefully. Parts of it did, she answered. Biology still influences behavior across the galaxy. But your species demonstrates that instinct is not always the controlling force. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod. Humans had to learn that the hard way. Lyra looked toward him with renewed curiosity. Explain. Daniel rested one hand on the edge of the workstation while thinking about how to describe thousands of years of human history in simple terms. For most of our past, he said slowly, people believed instinct was something you just followed. But over time we realized that actions have consequences that last much longer than the moment that created them. Families, communities, and entire societies depend on people thinking beyond immediate impulses. Lyra absorbed that explanation quietly. Her academic studies had covered the development of many civilizations, but almost all of them relied on biological timing to create stability first and social structure second. Humanity appeared to have built stability through reflection and shared responsibility instead. She walked slowly back toward the scanner console and looked at the line of data still glowing across the display. Continuous fertility. The words no longer felt like a dangerous anomaly. Instead, they looked like a question evolution had left unanswered. Daniel followed her gaze and smiled slightly. It looks alarming when you see it written like that, he admitted. Lyra nodded. At first, I believed it represented a potential threat to civilization. She paused while studying the quiet laboratory around them. Students from distant worlds moved through the hallway outside, unaware that a fundamental assumption about biology had just shifted inside this room. Now I believe it represents something else entirely. Daniel leaned against the workstation again. Which is? Lyra turned toward him, her expression calm but thoughtful. Your species may be the first example of a civilization where maturity is not defined by instinct, she said slowly. It is defined by restraint. Daniel considered that for a moment while the distant docking lights moved across the station ring beyond the glass wall. Finally, he gave a quiet laugh. You know, he said, humans usually call that growing up. Lyra looked back at the scanner display one last time and realized something that had not been part of her original research question. Evolution had created countless intelligent species across the galaxy. But humanity might be one of the few that survived not because their instincts were limited, but because their choices were. The laboratory lights remained steady as the Ore-Ion Exchange Institute continued its slow rotation through the quiet orbit around the blue star outside. The conversation between Lyra Veth and Daniel Carter had lasted far longer than either of them originally expected, yet neither seemed eager to end it. The medical scanner still displayed the same biological result that had begun the entire discussion, its glowing letters reflecting faintly across the polished surface of the console. Continuous fertility. Hours earlier, those words had appeared like a scientific contradiction. Now they felt more like the beginning of a new question. Lyra stood beside the console with her hands resting lightly on the edge while she reviewed the notes she had quietly recorded throughout the conversation. Every piece of data pointed toward the same conclusion. Humanity possessed a biological system that allowed constant reproductive capability without seasonal restriction, yet their civilization remained stable through something far less predictable than instinct. Daniel Carter leaned comfortably against the observation window once more, watching a shuttle nearly 200 feet long glide slowly toward its docking corridor while navigation lights blinked in steady rhythm along its hull. Students from multiple species moved through the hallway outside the laboratory, some carrying data tablets, others speaking quietly as they continued their own research projects. None of them realized that one of the most widely accepted biological assumptions in the galaxy had just been challenged inside this quiet room. Lyra finally closed the datapad and looked toward Daniel again. My lecture tomorrow will be very different, she said calmly. Daniel smiled faintly. You are going to tell them humans broke the rules of evolution? Lyra shook her head slightly. No, evolution did not fail. It simply produced a different solution. She walked slowly toward the observation window beside him and watched the stars for a moment before continuing. Most species survive because instinct protects their civilization from instability. Biological cycles limit the pressure of reproduction. Daniel nodded once. Makes sense. Lyra turned slightly toward him. But your species survived by developing something equally powerful. Daniel raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. Which is, Lyra allowed a brief, thoughtful pause while the distant station lights reflected in her pale blue eyes. Self-awareness, she said. Daniel considered the word carefully. You mean humans know what they are capable of? Lyra nodded. And they choose when it is appropriate to act on that capability. The laboratory fell silent again while the station drifted through another slow arc of starlight outside the window. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel glanced back toward the scanner console, where the biological result still glowed quietly. You know, he said thoughtfully, humans usually do not think of that as anything special. Lyra looked at the same line of data that had started everything. Continuous fertility. Then she looked back at the human student standing beside her. Perhaps that is exactly why it works, she replied softly. Outside the window, the stars continued their silent motion across the darkness, while the Orion Exchange Institute carried hundreds of civilizations forward through the quiet vastness of space. And somewhere in the middle of that vast galaxy, one species had proven something evolution had never predicted. Instinct may shape a civilization, but choice is what allows it to endure.